Good morning, everyone. So we've brought in 2 of the 6 grandchildren. And you are
Rose,
and
Faith.
to help lower the average age for the conference. So maybe that's helped. But really, seriously, we need the young folks and the children and the inheritors of the woodlands engaged. And this is one opportunity to bring them out and show them the forestry, get them on the woodland, because these are the next stewards of the woodland. So Rose, what's your favorite part of being on the woodlot?
Driving the side-by-side with David. The cabin.
The cabin. And I think maybe that Rose with her dad, what did you do last November, Rose, on the woodlot?
Hunting.
She went hunting for the first time. So that was pretty exciting, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay. So David is going to do the main presentation about some forestry work that we've been doing, and really with reference to windstorms and hurricanes. And I think, is Dr. Yvette Lloyd here yet? She's going to be...
She's coming at the
She's
time
coming.
of the presentation.
Okay, so I did want to say, and we'll see her after, a big thank you to her. We had a personal, horrible experience with the tick bite. David ended up 7 days in the hospital in New Glasgow, surprisingly with anaplasmosis, and we are in the know about ticks, we thought. The tick had only been on for 14 hours. It came out, no big deal, he went back to work, and he turned septic and was close to dying. Dr. Yvette Lloyd, we called her, and she was half an hour on the phone with us and was a wealth of information. So we owe her a lot of gratitude in what we learned. And I'm going to hand it over to David. Thank you, girls.
I'm already challenged. I've got to use both hands here.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? These mics, I know you got to hold them a certain way. So is that the right way?
Right.
All right. Okay. How many folks in the room have a woodlot or have a forest? Okay, so a lot. How many of you were affected by, say, one of the last 3 hurricanes in the last 21 years? Okay, so I'm not alone. It's the lesson here. One of the, when we came back, Julie and I spent half of our working career in New Brunswick in forestry. In 1999, we came back with the business idea that we were going to start doing selection harvesting. We bought one of the first selection harvesting machines in Nova Scotia, and we went to work doing commercial thinning, shelter woods, and so on. We're a big fan of selection harvesting. And so we devoted pretty much our whole career on our own woodlots. We started in the late 70s with my grandfather, doing shelter woods, doing selection harvesting. And then it evolved to commercial thinnings when we came back to Nova Scotia. And we grew the business to 5 machines. And I think last count, we had done somewhere in the vicinity of 15 to 18,000 acres of selection harvesting of one form or another. I can tell you today that 87% of all the selection harvesting that we've done in the last 25 years was destroyed by one of the last 3 hurricanes. So what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And so after Fiona, which did the most damage to our woodlots in West Hattamagush, we did a lot of soul searching about, you know, what do we need to do different? Because it's obvious that the way we're doing things, or the way that we had been doing things for the last 40 years, wasn't working so well with the hurricanes. And not just hurricanes. I mean, we've actually lost a lot of our stands to just wind events that have happened in between those 3 hurricanes. So it's not just hurricanes. I'm sure in past conferences, one of the bits of information that I got was that Nova Scotia experiences 150 more significant wind events than either New Brunswick or Maine. So they are literally our neighbors, and yet we experience 150 more significant wind events than either one of those jurisdictions. So it's obvious that because of our location, I mean, we're stuck out in the Atlantic, that wind is going to be a huge factor in anything that we do in relation to our forests. So Can't do anything about the hurricanes. If anything, they're going to get stronger and become more frequent. So Julia and I and others have been sort of scratching our heads wondering, what can we do different in terms of managing our forests to make it more hurricane-proof, if you will? And I'll tell you today, I'm not sure if I have the answer. I suspect I do not. But what we've done is we've started doing some things in the last 2.5 years on our woodlots to try to hurricane-proof them. And so where we started off is we drove around the back roads of West Hattamagush and North Colchester and Sutherland, Cumberland County, which is where the bulk of the damage was in our area. We drove around looking at areas that were significantly damaged and looking at areas that were not. And we looked at the height of trees, we looked at the types of trees, we looked at soil conditions, we looked at all those things. And I'm going to generalize here today, just for simplicity's sake. But what we noticed is that the natural stands that had not received some type of a selection harvest withstood the hurricanes the best. Now, there was exceptions to that rule. If the trees were over mature, they got nailed. If they were close to the Atlantic shoreline, they got nailed hard. So there were exceptions. But generally speaking, the stands that were not treated, the mature stands that were not treated, suffered the least amount of damage. So using that as a basis, we said, okay, how can we have our cake and eat it too? How can we have our forest that is somewhat hurricane-proof and still harvest some wood? And the answer that we have landed upon is what I'm going to call, and many of you are going to be familiar with this term, but it's gap harvesting, which is just a fancy way of talking about patch cuts. Small harvest cuts scattered throughout your woodlot that are, quite frankly, surrounded by the natural stands that you have not cut. And the premise or the idea of this is that if the natural stand, due to its density, due to its smaller crown size, if that's what allows that stand to survive, then those natural stands will end up acting as a buffer around the areas where you actually go in and do harvesting. Now, expanded gap is not something that Dave McMillan dreamed up. There's been numerous studies at the University of Maine, for example. Professor Bob Seymour has been studying expanded gap harvesting for quite a while. There's examples of his work that you can actually look at online in the Penobscot Experimental Forest and through the University of Maine's websites. And I would advise, or I'd suggest that if you're interested in this as an idea, then that's a really good place to go. Anyway, what do you do? What does expanded gap forestry look like? I should start off by showing kind of what we've been doing for the last 25 years. So this is an example. This is Kevin Smith in Malagash. Kevin Smith loves his woodlot. We did a commercial thinning on all of it. It was a beautiful forest. None of that forest exists today. Fiona completely destroyed it, 95% gone. So as much as I love commercial thinning, as much as I got into forestry in the 80s, got my education in the 80s when we started adopting Scandinavian forest ideas on how to manage forests. So I'm a real fan of commercial thinning. And that was a beautiful forest. The job turned out really well, and 3 years later it's gone completely. So this is a photograph that I took a couple days ago. This is Tom Reed's woodlot up in the Folly Lake mountain area. And this would be an example, this is nature's example of expanded gap forestry. So this is hurricane damage. It's a very small pocket of damage. And left to its own devices, this pocket or this opening is going to expand over time as wind enlarges the opening. And for tens of thousands of years before us Europeans came along and started cutting trees, this was nature's way of regenerating the Acadian forest in Nova Scotia. So one tree or a small group of trees would be either killed or knocked over, either by insects or maybe lightning strike, or in most cases wind. And so that opening would be relatively small, which would allow for the regeneration of like climax species like red spruce, hemlocks, pines, sugar maples, red oaks, and such. Because again, those small openings control the amount of sunlight. So small opening means not much light. Not much light means you don't get gray birch and poplar. You get the climax species. And so this was nature's way of basically establishing new forest in the Acadia before us Europeans came along. Expanded gap harvesting mimics this. The only significant difference is that instead of the trees lying on the ground and slowly decomposing, we're actually harvesting them and taking them roadside. This is an example of a shelter wood that I did around 1990 on our property in West Tatamagouche. I should point out that this property, my great-great-great-grandparents bought it in 1843 when they came from Scotland. Our granddaughters will be the 7th generation owners of this property. This is a stand of red and black spruce and a hybrid of red and black. The Hurricane Juan, back 22 years ago, Hurricane Juan knocked the shit out of this stand. This was one of the few remaining areas where the damage was minimal. We still ended up salvaging 25% of this stand as a result of that hurricane. And this is, although this is a more recent picture, this was the type of harvesting that we did after Juan. And we didn't call it expanded gap at the time, we called it salvaging the timber that blew down. It wasn't any more complicated than that. We drove around through our woodlot with our machines, and we basically gathered up the stuff in patches that actually had blown down. This is a recent job that we did at the Tim Hortons Children's Camp in Tatamagouche. They have approximately 200 acres of land with that children's camp, and because they're right on the ocean, a lot of their forest land got severely damaged with the hurricane. We attempted to salvage the blowdown using what we call expanded gap harvesting. So what you're looking at there is a very messy cut, and that's somewhat intentional because we wanted to leave any trees at all that were still standing. We wanted to leave those trees no matter what their size. We also wanted to leave a certain amount of coarse dead woody debris for ecological reasons, and we wanted the block to be relatively small. So this particular block is about 1/4 of an acre, and that's actually probably the optimal size if you're talking about doing expanded gap harvesting. Small patch cuts of 1/4 to 1/2 an acre, again, is the right size. And the reason it's the right size is because, again, we want shade. We don't want to grow poplar and gray birch, we want to grow red spruce. So to do that, we want to minimize the amount of sunlight that hits that cut. And so in both of these cuts, you'll see that these ones are actually long and narrow. And that was intentional. We even oriented them so that the trees that are standing acted as shade for the actual cut. Because again, we wanted to minimize the amount of light hitting the ground. Another example of that. This is a different kettle of fish. This is a plantation that my mother and I planted in 1991. It's a black spruce plantation. It's on imperfectly drained ground. So it is the worst possible place to do a selection harvest, for blowdown. However, because I'm so addicted to selection harvesting, we decided to try something as an experiment. And in this case, this is actually what we call our new version of a commercial thinning. But what it is, it's just simply trails. we did not cut a single tree on either side of the actual trail. All we did was put in trails. And the idea, again, is to minimize the opportunity for the wind to get into that stand. And so, we're not sure how this is going to work out. However, what I can tell you is that in a typical commercial thinning, you want to remove about 30% of the basal area, which is typically about 50% of the trees. Well, trails are typically 15% of the basal area removal. So half of the actual thinning in a thinning is the trails. So what we've done here is we've removed 15% of the basal area instead of 30, but we've maintained all of the trees on either side of those trails. And the point of that is twofold. Number one, we're hoping that density is what's going to keep that stand upright when the next hurricane comes along. But the trail itself acts as a thinning. So the trees on either side of that trail are going to benefit from that opening. The trails are actually quite narrow. We kept them down below 10 feet. And this stand, again, was planted in 91, 92, so it's about 34 years of age. There was some hurricane damage in it. Another example of the trail. This was actually one of the pockets within that plantation that was hit. So again, this was another example of this expanded gap harvesting. This is a small, probably only an eighth of an acre patch cut within that plantation. And we're hoping that that is small enough that the next hurricane won't cause significant damage. I want to go back to this picture you've already seen. This, again, was a shelterwood that was done in the early 90s. We've actually done 2 harvests within this shelterwood in the years since then. But back in was it 2013? We had Hurricane Warren? 2003, sorry. So in 2003, we actually had pockets that blew down within this stand. And we went in and we salvaged that about a year later, so in 2004. This is an example of one of those pockets that we salvaged. And the reason I'm showing you this patch of regeneration is this is one of the nicest patches of natural regeneration that we have anywhere on our 1,500 acres of woodland in West Haddamagosh. And it's totally accidental because all we did was go in and salvage the timber on this 1/4 acre patch of ground that blew down within that shelterwood. We didn't plant it, we didn't do anything to establish the regeneration, and yet what's growing there is hemlock, red spruce, red oak. There's even 2 sugar maples. I don't know where they came from, because there's no sugar maple in West Haddamagosh, I can tell you. Again, it's the nicest regen ever. And this was sort of the clue to us that maybe instead of single tree selection, where you basically go in and you take a tree here, a tree there, and so on, that actually these small patch cuts actually do a better job of creating regeneration than the single tree selection. This is the same stand next door. This was shelterwooded in 1990, so 35 years ago. How much regeneration do you see? Barely any. And yet, right next to it, where we did a patch cut, there's the regeneration. So, this was sort of our light bulb moment, that in West Haddamagosh, in the type of clay soils that we have, in perfectly drained clay soils that we have in West Haddamagosh, if you want to get regeneration, we think this is the way to go in our particular sphere of things. So what does, from a practical perspective, what does expanded gap forestry look like? Or what's it going to look like on the McMillan properties? Well, my granddaughters, because they're very artistic, they have created the West Haddamagosh MacMillan woodland here for you. So, what we're going to do, let's assume that this is a stand that hasn't had a treatment. So what we're going to do in terms of selection harvesting this stand, and as you can see, we've got hardwoods, we've got softwoods, so we've got basically a mixed wood forest. Well, we're going to go in and we're going to cut a trail, and then we're going to create our first gap. And that gap can be any shape you want. The experts will tell you that if the gap, the actual patch cut, is irregular in shape, that's going to give you way greater ecological benefits. And I know this to be true. I'll use rabbits or snowshoe hares as an example. Snowshoe hares really don't like going out into cutovers, no matter what the size. But if that cutover suddenly is a really strange shape, so that there's corners and dips and hollows, then they feel a lot safer. And so that's one of the reasons why irregular shape makes sense. So anyway, we're going to do a little patch cut. We're going to cut a trail to the next one. We're going to do a little patch cut. We're going to go a little bit further, do another little patch cut. And then work our way over, do another one, work our way over, do another one, work our way over, do another one, and so on. Where does the expanded part come in? Well, the idea is that once you've done these initial small cuts, and again, quarter acre, half acre is considered the optimal size. And again, the key thing is to minimize sunlight on the ground. So we're basically going to walk away from that stand for probably 15 years. The growth rate in our part of the world, or the time it takes to get regeneration established in our part of the world, is about 5 years. And then if you want to give those trees a chance to grow and develop, you're probably looking at 10 to 15 years. So basically, we're going to walk away from this area for the next 10 to 15 years. However, when that 15 years rolls around, we're going to come back and we're going to do another harvest. And this is where the expanded part comes in. What we're going to do is we're going to use the same trail system, but what we're going to do is we're going to cut maybe a 40-foot strip around that initial opening. And then we're going to go to the next one and we're going to cut another 30, 40, 25-foot strip. And again, shade is the deciding factor as to how wide that strip is, because you want shade on the ground so you don't get that gray birch poplar. We're going to basically expand all of those initial cuts by basically just cutting a ring around them all. And then we're going to walk away again for another 10 to 15 years. When that time rolls around, guess what? We're going to expand it again. Eventually, these blocks are going to join up, as you can see, right? However, you've got 1, 2, 3, probably 4, maybe even 5 different age classes in each of those patch cuts. And the reason why we think that this is the right approach for us moving forward in the time of hurricanes is that let's say we do this and a hurricane comes along even a year later. Because we have the existing system, because these openings were relatively small, even if we experience blowdown from the hurricane, and we're thinking it's going to be minimal, because again, we haven't touched any of the natural forest around it. So if this natural forest being dense is the solution to avoiding hurricane damage, then we've maintained a big bulk of this. But as time goes by, this regeneration in the different circles, or different bands, is going to keep growing. So by the time you do your third or fourth cut here, you've probably already got 20 to 30 foot tall regeneration happening in your initial pocket. And we know from our experience that the younger forests, like the plantation pictures that we showed you that we put trails through, we only had 2% blowdown within those plantations. Even though those plantations were on soft ground, they were black spruce, which is not terribly wind firm on a good day, and yet we only had about 2% blowdown within those plantations. So logic would suggest that those plantations should have blown down. Why didn't they? Well, the answer is that they didn't have super big crowns. And I know part of our objective with shelter wooding and so on is that we want big fluffy crowns on those trees because we want the growth rate and we want the seeding capabilities of those bigger trees and so on. However, we also know that those big crowns act as big sails. And that's what happened with Hurricane Fiona. We have a fair bit of red oak on our land, which is probably the most wind-firm tree in Nova Scotia. And we lost about 25% of our red oaks. And we think it was because we grew those red oaks to have big, massive crowns within our shelter woods, and that was the reason that they ultimately blew down. So I think too much of a good thing is not a good thing. So I think to our way of thinking, we've got to move away from this idea that we want trees with big, heavy crowns. I think actually we want something sort of in the middle of the road, where you want a healthy crown, but we don't want it to be super big. Well, how do you control that? You control that with density. And again, natural forests tend to be incredibly dense. Make sense? Okay, my wife's whispering in my ear, time's up. Any questions?